Avenue Presbyterian Church in downtown Washington, D.C. Like many public educational programs, we've been mostly online during the past 3 years, and we're in the process of finding the best way to have both online and in-person events that feature our McClendon scholars. We don't want to lose those of you who tune in via webinar, especially those who are far away from Washington, but there's also something wonderful about in-person interaction, and so we're going to try to build that into our programs whenever we can. As we begin, we always like to hear from those of you who are participating in the webinar to know where you are and where you live. We did a poll at our last meeting, and more than 1/3 of the people tuned in live more than 500 miles from Washington. So we know you are out there in far-flung places. So take a moment and in the chat, type in where you're from, your name. If you're with a particular congregation or organization, you might want to also mention that. And just continue to type that in as you can. It's always good to have, and we like to look at it afterwards and get a sense where people are joining us from. Those who are here in person have already had a chance to meet each other. Be sure to say hi to others at your table. If you haven't met them yet, you can do that briefly now, and certainly you'll have a chance to visit later on. So we're delighted to have Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock with us as a summer scholar, and this is the second lecture that she has prepared and presented for us. She gave an online webinar lecture on July 12th. She will also preach here tomorrow morning in the worship service at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. I hope many of you will come in person, both those watching and those who are here now. And it also will be available online, as all the NYAPC worship services are. So I'll introduce Dr. Brock in just a moment. Let me just explain the format briefly. She'll make her presentation. She's going to be using some PowerPoint slides and talking you through what I think will be a very interesting lecture. When she is finished, we'll have then an opportunity for questions, and I'll go first to those of you here. I'll also be monitoring the questions coming in online, and looking at those. So if you in the webinar audience have questions, be sure to type them into the Q&A function. Now use Q&A, not chat, so that's what I'll be monitoring and looking for questions, and we hope that we'll have time at the very end to also bring in some questions from those of you who are online. After the question period, Dr. Brock will make some final summary comments about what she wants to emphasize, and then we'll close with some more information about her work and how you can learn more about what she is doing, as well as some future McClendon Scholar programs that I look forward to telling you about. So we're delighted to have Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock with us today. She is Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Programs at Volunteers of America. She's an ordained ordained minister of the Christian Church, or Disciples of Christ, as some of us know that denomination, and a prominent scholar who was the first Asian American woman to earn a doctorate in theology. She has written extensively and taught at colleges, seminaries, and universities across the country that are as diverse as Valparaiso University, Stevens College, Harvard Divinity School, Hamline University, and Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University. So overall, she has more than 25 years of experience as a professor. She is also an award-winning author. In 2012, she co-authored one of the first books on moral injury, Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, and her 2008 book with Rebecca Parker, Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire, was selected as one of the year's best books in religion by Publishers Weekly and was a finalist for the American Academy Religion Award in Constructive Reflective Studies. Earlier in her career, in 1996, she published another award-winning book with co-author Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite, who I will mention was a McClendon scholar about 10 or 12 years ago. That book was entitled Casting Stones, Prostitution and Liberation in Asia and the United States, which won the Catholic Press Award in Gender Studies. In 2017, she led the creation of Volunteers of America's successful evidence-based moral injury recovery program for military veterans using peer-facilitated small groups called Resilient Strength Training, which was pilot tested for 2 years and is now available to the public. And it is this work in moral injury work that she is most known for these days. She's had a wonderful and rich career. We're delighted she's with us today and glad to have Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock.
Thank you very much. It's really a privilege and honor to be speaking to you in such an historic place. I feel the weight of it in some sense, that Abraham Lincoln was attended here during the Civil War. It's a pretty amazing legacy you have as a church. So thank you for inviting me to be here. And just a slight correction, I'm a commissioned minister, not an ordained minister. We have two categories in the disciples. One is that you're ordained for life, and wherever you go and whatever work you do, you're a minister. And then there's a commissioned ministry, which is you don't feel called to congregational ministry or ordained ministry, but the work you do counts as ministry. So I've been commissioned a number of times, but when I haven't needed to be commissioned, I haven't been called a minister. It's a kind of weird thing, but right now I am one. The Volunteers of America is a nonprofit incorporated as a church, and we have our own ministry program. So I'm a commissioned minister. And I want to begin with a story that sort of captures some of the points I want to make today, because it's a really interesting and sort of things happen in it that are unexpected. And the story is of an Iraq war veteran named Joshua Castile, who passed away, I think it was in 2014 or 2013, from brain cancer. And now those of us who loved and knew him, think it had something to do with him being ordered to guard burn pits while he was in Iraq. Joe Biden's son had a similar kind of brain tumor. So Joshua grew up in an evangelical Protestant family in Iowa. Both his parents are evangelical ministers. He was chair of the Republican Club in high school and a Rush Limbaugh fan. He got a commission to West Point because he wanted to enlist. He got a commission at West Point, but he found it wasn't a good fit for him. So he switched into the ROTC and went back to Iowa and finished his work there, and then enlisted. And they taught him Arabic and made him an Arabic language specialist. He's really good at languages. So when he was sent to Iraq, he was sent to Abu Ghraib, which is the infamous prison where they did the torture. And he was sent there 2 months after the torture story broke, he said, to do cleanup work. We had to do clean interrogations. So he did 100 or more interrogations. And the 3 or 4 months he was doing interrogation. And he started to feel horrible because he said, no one I interrogated really had any information, and I'm pretty sure most of them were innocent people. They were just farmers or taxi drivers or even students who just kind of were in the wrong place and got picked up and sent to the prison. So he started to feel pretty miserable. And then he got a fat file from a person in the prison who actually admitted to crossing the border from Saudi Arabia to fight the Americans in Iraq. So he thought finally he could use his skills as a real interrogator, and he was going to interrogate this guy. And he went into the prison and went into the interrogation room and started interrogating him. And the guy admitted to crossing the border. And he said, well, why did you cross a border to murder people or something like that? And the Muslim said to him, because it's the duty of faithful Muslims to protect other Muslims from foreign invasions. He said, I went to help my fellow Muslims defend their country. And then he said, why did you come here to kill people? And Joshua said, I didn't come here to be. He said, well, you came with an army with weapons and the military. Why did you come? And Joshua, who believed you should love your enemies and do good to those who persecute. I mean, he was a faithful evangelical Christian, realized he didn't have an answer to the guy's question. And then he realized that really what he wanted to do was have a conversation with him about the meaning of faith. And so he stopped the interrogation and he walked down the hall and told his superior officer that he had broken objectivity and he couldn't do the interrogation and he didn't want to do interrogations anymore, which is when he got reassigned to the burn pit. And through a process of thinking about how he was feeling, he decided he needed to become a conscientious objector. But the Protestant chaplain wouldn't support him. And so he found the Catholic chaplain did. And as he was sharing with the chaplain how miserable he was feeling, the chaplain gave him, he said, this book that had prayers in it. It was probably a common book of prayer, but he got this book, and he said, you know, as an evangelical, you're taught to pray sincerely from your heart in your own words, and that's a sincere heart is what God will hear, and all of those sorts of ideas that are very Protestant. But he said when he opened that book of prayer and he started thumbing through it, he said he found people who had words for how he felt that he didn't have for himself. And then it made him feel like, wow, hundreds of years ago, people felt the same things I'm feeling. And it made him feel less isolated and alone. And it took him, I think, 10 months to get his CO status approved, but it was approved, and so he was discharged from the military. He converted to Catholicism and actually had an audience with the Pope. And when he passed away, he was working on a graduate degree at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and he'd also gotten a master's in writing, was writing plays about his war experience. So his story, that what happened to him in that process of struggling with his own conscience, and in the military it's called a crystallization of conscience when you come to this position of being a conscientious objector, happened to him in some of the worst possible situations you could imagine. I want to make a case in this talk that moral injury, this term, I'm going to explain what it is for those of you who didn't hear my first lecture, why it's changing some of the landscape even in mental health. And certainly, I think, theologically, it raises serious questions about certain doctrines in Western Christianity, because I'm hearing clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, and people who don't make universal claims about human nature usually, they tend to be like evidence-based, saying we are all born moral. Not sinful, moral. Because our whole body apparatus is designed to need love. And the ways we maintain loving relationships is we behave morally. So Joshua Castile had a classic case of moral injury. He had an identity crisis and a meltdown. This term moral injury, I think, is really, really important. It comes out of military veterans. It's now being applied to everybody, but there's a history to how this term came into being. I think it's important to understand how it pops focus in a way that has been unfocused for a while. So originally in the 18th century, it wasn't that people didn't notice that soldiers were pretty miserable sometimes when they were at war, but they called it nostalgia or homesickness, like their heart hurt to go home, and they thought that individual soldiers just had problems with homesickness. They called it that in the 18th century. In the 19th century, during the Civil War, a period when this church was active, they called it soldier's heart. But it's the same problem. Individual soldiers just couldn't stick it out, just kind of had an emotional or meltdown. They called it soldier's heart. In World War I and II, shell shock kind of emerged as that term. But if you remember the movie Patton, you know, Patton's really angry with one of the soldiers who's having this kind of a meltdown, and he just thinks it's a lack of character. The guy's just a weakling. And if you've seen Oppenheimer, Truman kind of thought that of Oppenheimer because he regretted the bomb, and he just said, I don't want that crybaby in here. So that sense of shell shock, combat stress reaction, endured through the Vietnam War. And it was called post-Vietnam syndrome at the Vietnam War. There were all kinds of terms for trying to explain why some people couldn't take it. And finally, as people were, like Jonathan Shea, were working with military veterans, they began to realize that this was not an individual character flaw. That catastrophic effects, the catastrophic events can have serious impact on people that they can't control. So even somebody who's strong and tough and of good character can be destroyed by an event if it's catastrophic enough, like war. And so they lobbied and lobbied and lobbied, and it took till 1980 for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, to become a diagnosable mental health condition that could be treated at the VA. And that was really significant because it opened the doors for all those Vietnam veterans that were just regarded as individual problems that the VA couldn't treat. It finally opened the doors for the VA to treat people for delayed PTSD and chronic PTSD from many generations, but especially a generation of Vietnam that wasn't getting that kind of care. So I think it's hard not to celebrate that, to say finally the VA took responsibility for the wars that Congress decides to prosecute. And so that was in 1980. It got revised a little later to a trauma stressor-related disorder, but it's largely based on having your brain overfunction in its fear mode. That the catastrophic event makes your fear system so overactive that you can't calm down in normal situations. You might have nightmares or be hypervigilant or all of those sorts of things. The problem, which Chris Webb, an Iraq veteran and an anthropologist, says, is that the problem with this is that it's a medical model. It's basically an individual thing. You treat the individual, they get better. And that's true for PTSD. It is true that there are really good treatments that have evolved since 1980 that are very effective for PTSD, but that wasn't helping the suicide rates. As they were doing that at the VA, the suicide rates for veterans kept going up. So it was like, what is going on with veterans? And the term they came up with to explain what they thought was going on is moral injury. And it's not, and this is so crucial a distinction, it is not a mental health disorder. It is a function of our being born moral. And so there are levels of severity of it. It's just an ordinary conscience-based response to harm. And sometimes the harm is relatively trivial. You step on somebody's foot, you know you did something to hurt them, so you apologize. But if you kill them, that's a whole other order of harm. And so moral discomfort is an ordinary human experience. It happens frequently in people's lives. We learn ways as we grow up of handling it. Often it's habitual, just an apology, like, I'm sorry I stepped on your foot. Are you okay? Sometimes you have to make recompense, you have to pay somebody back because you stole money or whatever, but there's ways to restore balance in relationships that we all learn as part of having moral discomfort. Moral distress is one order of severity greater. It's when you can't figure out how to fix it. It's not obvious. The solution to the moral harm isn't obvious, or it accumulates. And there's been a lot of discussion about moral distress in nursing from the pandemic, because when your job is to save lives and help people die, and you can't do either because you're too busy intubating and trying to keep people alive at all, that the distress that you feel, you have to stuff it. You cannot dwell on how terrible you feel. You just have to get the job done and put one foot in front of the other. So the stuff accumulates. And it can create what's called burnout. You just don't feel yourself. You need a break from it to reflect on it. And sometimes it takes a while to process it all. So moral distresses, it can start to interfere with daily functioning. You may start to lose sleep, just wonder whether you want to keep your job anymore. I once was in a group with a chaplain who said, I have a hard time talking about this because every time I do, I start to sob. And then she explained how for 9 months in a hospital situation, all she'd done is help people die. And when we talked about affirmations at the end of the group, she said, I guess I can affirm myself because I got up and went to work this morning. But that she was really struggling just to go to work. That's moral distress, and it can be pretty severe. When moral distress becomes a load too much to bear, people break. And they break in different ways. They may decide to give up on a career they have loved and lose their sense of mission and life purpose, and flounder because they don't know what to do now, but they can't stand the work they've had to do. They may work to exhaustion all the time so they don't have to think about how terrible they feel. Or they may use some drugs or alcohol to numb the emotional pain that they don't want to feel. And if it's severe enough, they may decide to die by suicide. And there's a lot of, I think, consensus in the population that works with veterans that the biggest factor for suicide in veterans is moral injury, not PTSD. Often they go together, so they get confused. So what causes moral injury? It can be something you did yourself, transgressing your own values, like abandoning a patient because you have to intubate another patient even though you know that other patient is going to die and you need to help them die, but you can't because you have to try to save this other person, and then they both die. So you feel responsible even if it wasn't anything you could have done to prevent those deaths. Or you kill somebody in combat, you kill somebody in a car accident that you didn't because you were texting. I actually know someone who died because a teenager was texting and had a head-on collision. So that teenager is going to live with that the rest of their life. So those are horrible things to live with. It can also be you were harmed. And that's been the mode for a lot of the Vietnam generation because they were drafted and they didn't want to go to war and their government made them, so they're angry. So outrage and toxic anger is one of the consequences of moral injury. Instead of taking your own life, you become violent toward others, or you just have a hair trigger kind of anger, and you just are angry about everything. And you're hard to live with, become cynical or depressed. Those are all consequences of moral injury. So this is the paradox of moral injury. Moral injury is a sign of mental and moral health. If you aren't bothered by some of the things I described, you're probably a sociopath. Right? If the last 5 years there's not been anything morally distressing to you, then I think you just were like living in a cave somewhere and never watched the news. So I agree with Rabbi Blumenthal. It's a sign of mental and moral health that you suffer so much. So, as I said, moral injury is not a disorder because it's a very complex, I think it's a spiritual problem. And it's a combination of memory. You have to actually remember an incident to have a cause and effect assessment of it. So you have a memory, and your conscience is evaluating that memory. and your conscience makes a judgment about that memory that harm was done, and maybe you're responsible or somebody else, but harm was done. And then there's the time element, which just makes moral injury unpredictable. I know an Air Force veteran who for 40 years, as he said, I played a lot of golf, I made a lot of money, and didn't think about what I did in the Air Force, and then I got really sick and it slammed me. His moral injury hit him 40 years out. Now, it had been in there, but he hadn't thought about it. And that can happen. You can have somebody, Truman Smith in his memoir of World War II as a bomber pilot, his book is called The Wrong Stuff. He has a sense of humor. But he describes how he went on with his life, married, had children, and then he had a chance to sit in the cockpit of an antique plane that he flew in World War II, and he said he saw in that cockpit, everything slammed him. But he hadn't thought about those things for all those years. So people can have it right in the impact of doing something. My friend Camilo, as soon as he shot somebody in Iraq, he just realized he crossed a line that he'd never get back across. Others, it takes decades. So that's the other thing, is people can seem okay. They can get on with their lives and they can function and put it aside, but it will need to be processed at some point, and I know plenty of hospice workers that have veterans who want to confess something before they die. So you can never forget the worst things that ever happened to you. You may try not to think about them, but they don't disappear. That's why it's crucial, I think, as a mission for the church, to figure out how to help people with moral injury. Some people call it a broken heart, living with a broken heart, because you're living with an unreconcilable moral or ethical conflict. It's interesting, in the early church, you never see Jesus dead. When he's on a cross, he's alive, and he's not shown on the cross most of the time in any church. They just completely ignore his crucifixion in the artwork for 1,000 years. But they show Judas because he betrayed Jesus. So in the ancient church, betrayal was a major thing, a major way that people were condemned for behavior that they did. So I would make a case that Judas is a case of moral injury because he tried to give the money back and then he hung himself. So there's also collective moral injury. I think it's important to understand that as well, because you can live within a system itself that's oppressive. Poverty is that kind of system, where you can't make a good choice. You just have to make a lesser evil choice a lot of the time. Do you buy medicine for your kids or pay the rent? Those kind of choices. You can also wind up with the moral values happen within systems. So you can make what's called an agential shift. You can move from one system of values to another system of values, which happens to people 18 to 26 if they enlist in the military. They actually go through rigorous training to change their value system so that they are willing to die for someone else and to kill for someone else. Most people 18 to 26 don't even think about those things. And in fact, if they even thought about those things, people would wonder about them. There's a thing called collective moral injury that happens to entire groups of people. And I think a lot of the Vietnam era generation of veterans had that kind of collective experience, not only in war, but also in the way the country received them when they came home, which was not very nice. And this was true of mainline Protestant churches, began to drift away from supporting the war, and when they turned against the Vietnam War, they also turned against veterans in the military. They just associated it all with one thing and became very negative. So these collective forms of moral injury also impact people and can become intergenerational. And you can, for example, make that agential shift and go into a profession, and you do that work for a long time. This is true, I think, for military veterans. They're in that, as long as they're in the military system, they have a system where their values work and they're able to function well and maybe even get medals and get discharged honorably. And then they have to actually shift back into a civilian world without hardly any help to make that transition. And it's a huge transition. It took 9 weeks to get them into the military. They're out in a week. And that agential shift back to civilian life is often when they start to melt down and start to think about what happened and what they did, and not to feel so good about it even if they got a medal. So those are all ways that are collective moral injury. It's not individual veterans. It's just a group. That's part of the veteran experience for a lot of veterans, not all of them, but a lot of veterans. So if you don't have ways to help people make those agential shifts, to process how they're feeling about some of the stuff that's making them feel terrible, then they wind up stuck in unaddressed moral injury, which involves often fury, frustration, guilt, shame, despair, and cynicism. Those are all markers. Socially isolated, they feel terrible, so they're not emotionally available. A lot of what they feel is not available. They're sort of cold or shut down or angry all the time. Those are all signs of moral injury. And it affects everyone who knows that person and cares about that person. It will just, and because they have an identity crisis going and they aren't able to make good meaning out of their lives anymore, they lose their sense of shared meaning with the people they relate to that sustains their relationships. They also lose trust and are unable to explain their behavior or integrate their memories in a coherent way that makes sense of them. And it's not reversible. You can't forget the horrible things that happened to you. You have to figure out how to accept them. So recovery from moral injury isn't a fix. You can't fix it in a way that you can fix a broken leg. It's more like the leg was amputated. You have to figure out how you're going to live a good life without that leg, because it's not going to come back. And it can be intergenerational. If you have one generation that hasn't processed all the moral injury experiences and trauma of their generation, their children can be affected by that. In a number of ways. A woman who studied children of the Holocaust, literature says that sometimes the next generation can feel like their own lives are sort of insignificant and trivial compared to the drama and the importance of the previous generation. And so they actually take the previous generation's trauma and feelings on as their own, as a sort of crusade around representing those traumas in their own lives, to give their own lives some sense of meaning because they feel like they're sort of trivial. So it's a very complicated process, this intergenerational process. So if you're interested in, I'm not going to go into this in depth, but if you're interested in how the moral injury isn't just in the veteran community, but is in the first responder, the healthcare, the teacher, the whole bunch of people since COVID have there's some articles now studying moral injury in all these different populations. And Elizabeth Svoboda wrote a pretty nice review essay last year in Scientific American that captures the broad range of it. She interviewed all kinds of people about how moral injury shows up in their lives. It's a pretty good study. So we can all feel like we have moral injury individually, but we recover collectively. And that's what the rest of my talk is about in relation to what helps that recovery process, especially in relation to what churches can do. And the reason I work in this area is I think the therapeutic approach to individual is mostly individual focused, and it's professionals who understand something that helps you get your arms around it. And so I think religious communities offer something different. And I don't think they're so much in competition, but I think they're different. And the differences matter. And I think you'll understand what I mean later when I talk about ritual. But so with the biomedical model, it's pretty much an individual you treat for something that lots of people may have, but you're working on the individual. In religious communities, it's a lot more oriented toward community support. In the therapeutic approach, you have someone who can evaluate and diagnose and treat your problem. In the religious communities, and it's often the job of chaplains, is to just listen and accompany people as they struggle with things. And then the individual approach is, and this is, I think, the key thing with ritual is it's different, is when you go in for therapy, the therapist can diagnose and give you things you can do, but it's all on you to fix yourself. You actually have to take that advice and then fix yourself. And ritual doesn't work that way. You wind up changed by ritual, you don't even know how you got there. Because you didn't have to do it all by yourself. And then there's a transactional relationship in therapy that's about billable hours. And whereas in a religious community, your minister's on salary, but they don't bill by the hour. They might have to spend days with you, but that's okay. And then there are other people in the church that aren't even being paid, and they might spend days with you, and that's okay. And you're in a lifetime relationship as long as you're in that community, whereas when you're in therapy, if you get better, you can't see your therapist ever again. Which is a very different relationship. And then, because the recovery ends the relationship with a therapist, whereas in a religious community, you get to be with all the people who helped you, and you help them. It's a very different way of doing things. And I think they're not so much in conflict as they are complementary. So I'm going to take the PowerPoint down for now, so people who are watching virtually don't have to stare at the same screen forever. Because I'm going to say some things about ritual that sort of is counterintuitive for Protestants. So first of all, human beings are social animals. We're born with a neurological system that needs other people all our lives. It's not just that we need nurture from a family, but we need friends. And as the Surgeon General said, there's an epidemic of loneliness right now. And loneliness is bad for your health. That's how much we need each other. So we're social animals, and our emotions are highly contagious. I've experienced this as a professor. I one time was writing something on a blackboard, and I could feel behind me the whole room of students get angry. I couldn't see them. I just feel it. I just feel my body tense up, and I thought, oh, something's going. And I turned around, and they were all like, so I asked them why they were angry, and so we had a conversation about what I was saying, and it turned into one of the best classes I had that semester, because they got to talk about how they were feeling about what I was saying. And I was reporting a book, so it wasn't my opinion, but they thought I was saying it. So we had to sort all that out. And how you can understand a position you don't like at all, but you have to be fair to it, that sort of thing. So our emotions are highly contagious. It's important that they are, because if you're in a jungle and the point person sees a tiger and everybody's alarm needs to go off right away. They can't, it's like, this is like an important evolutionary trait we have, is that our emotions are contagious, and especially fear. But happiness can be also. So all of our meaning systems and our moral behavior are social. They're learned. We learn them from the time we're born. They're reinforced through repetition, often pretty ritually. You know, you tell your 2-year-old, say you're sorry. Say you're sorry. Say you're sorry. Eventually they get it, but it's the same phrase over and over. So there's this repetition. If you're not consistent with it, it's confusing. If you say you're sorry, and they say, why don't you apologize? Like, okay. So there's a value to the consistency, and we begin by that process to develop very stable habits that are actually pretty hard to dislodge unless something serious goes wrong. And Anna Graybiel is a neuroscientist at MIT who studies how your brain handles learning and functioning. And she makes a case that when we learn something new and we're beginning to develop it as a habit, all of our brain's neural systems, and not just our thinking part of our brain, but all of our interactive from the brain cell stem on up, All of those systems are engaged with the learning process, laying down new neural circuits. So that and once you repeat the behavior enough and the neural circuits get put in place, then it becomes habitual and you don't have to think. So most of us are moral by habit. We don't think every day, every minute of the day, what is the right thing to do? In fact, I think most of the time, we rarely ask ourselves that question unless something went wrong. And what we did didn't work or somebody hurt us. Then we're going to engage our thinking brain and make a judgment and wonder about it and figure out how to fix it because it's bothering us. But on a daily basis, we just are nice to people and do our thing because we've been habitually trained in that behavior. Which is why the military has to work so hard to change people's habits and behaviors. So, we really learn to be moral by habit. So rituals are really crucial to that process. And by ritual in church, I'm talking about shared repeat processes that occur in liminal space and time. It's a pretty big mouthful. So this is a collective experience. Everybody does the same behavior. And the experience takes place in a space and time that isn't ordinary space and time. A liminal space and time has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know it's not going to be like ordinary life. And it can be as simple as a hospital chaplain walking into a patient's room and saying, "May I pray with you?" And if the patient says yes, a ritual has begun. And it's not the normal thing happening in the hospital. It's just a frozen moment that's in that liminal space and time. The hospital bed has now become a ritual place. And it's over with amen. So a ritual can be 2 minutes long. It can take hours. And the Navajo Enemy Way ceremonial, which they use for people who are returning from war, takes days. Our process for veterans with moral injury takes 50 hours. So it can, these things take anywhere from a short period of time, but that's what makes it a ritual. And often there's a way you set aside the space and time. Churches are that kind of space, but so are outdoor spaces can be that as well. It's not. You don't have to build a space. You just have to say this is the space. Something marks the beginning of that liminal space and time. In the hospital, let us pray might be that. In baseball, it's play ball. It's the same thing. A game is not ordinary life, right? It has rules that govern it, and you don't play your life normally by the rules of baseball. And baseball is interesting because, of course, it doesn't run on a clock. What happens actually determines when it ends. But yet it's still inside this liminal space and time. It's just like, you might be at a 4-hour baseball game or you might be at a 1-hour baseball game. You don't know till you get there, but you give yourself to it, and somebody says play ball, and then you're in that space. And that's how a ritual works. It's the same kind of active imagination that human beings do. It's a little counterintuitive for a Protestant to go on and on about ritual because in the Protestant Reformation, there was a rejection of almost all the Catholic rituals except baptism and Eucharist. There was a sort of Protestant attitude that ritual was superstition. Which is why when anthropologists get their degrees, they go off and study other cultures that have a lot of rituals because it's exotic, right? And I think that means we don't really think about how much of our own lives are ritualized, but we also don't focus on creating really beautiful ritual. Episcopalians may be an exception, but Catholics do. I mean, they have very rote kind of processes for their rituals. Protestants, you're supposed to be sincere and pray for your own faith, and it's very much focused on your own individual personal faith and subjectivity. And so rituals are often understood to be an expression of your individual faith. Like you go to worship, you go to a ritual because you believe. And that's actually a kind of a minority opinion about ritual in a lot of cultures. You do the ritual because it's the ritual. What you believe is your own business. So in Buddhism, for example, they don't tell you, you don't have to believe the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the Buddha's Dharma or any of that sort of thing. If you just go and do the meditation ritual and stick with it, they know it works. They don't care what you believe. In Buddhism, if believing, it's called expedient means. If believing in God makes you a better person, then go ahead, believe in God. That's sort of the attitude. It's not that you must believe in anything in particular. It's whatever works for you best. But the ritual is effective. So they understand the meditation ritual is effective. Tai Chi, a lot of these. Now they've become so common in Western culture, people don't even think of them as religious rituals. Mindfulness is taught in schools, right? But if you actually do mindful practice in a serious way, it does change you. It's sort of remarkable. So a lot of societies, indigenous societies, use ritual to negotiate lots of things that we depend on for our own personal sincerity to negotiate. So people in very ritualized societies are able to play multiple roles and identifications, and they can coexist with differences and ambiguity and conflict in ways that are they just use rituals. You don't have to personally like somebody, you just have to do the ritual as if you did like them. The version we have that in church is passing the peace. You often see people who don't like each other much still pass the peace, right? Well, people would think, some people would call that hypocritical, right? Because you have to be expressing your personal belief. But actually, you want a community where people who don't like each other can say hello to each other. So you enact that even in the ritual process. And in some cultures, they even have roles assigned in ritual processes like jesters to make fun of people with power, and they don't get punished for it, right? Because it's their role to do that. So they're called trickster figures, the jester in a court, or coyote in Native American, or they're different ways that this trickster disrupts the ordinary flow of power and things as part of a ritual process. So there are these ritual strategies in a lot of cultures that are actually indifferent to personal sincerity, so that in the liminal space of the ritual, you can cross into other roles and imagine things that you don't actually believe yourself, or be part of something with empathy, even if it's not your experience. That's how ritual sort of pulls you up out of your misery of your own feelings and relativizes them in relation to other people who may also respect your feelings. But it's a process of somehow in the external world around you in a ritual, you get to process your inner world with imagination and with empathy for others. And that actually will relativize how miserable you feel. And where this happens most obviously, even in Protestantism, are memorial services and death and dying rituals. Because you go to a memorial service because you feel terrible that someone died that you cared about, and then you go through a ritual process because you know you're going to feel better at the end. And you didn't have to do it yourself. You trusted the person leading the ritual. You listened to other people who knew that person, and you sang some songs and listened to some scriptures and prayers, and somehow you got out the other end, and you're surprised sometimes at how much better you feel. Sometimes it doesn't work, but Not every ritual is successful, but this is what ritual means. It helps people handle all of these fierce forces in life that otherwise might destroy you or leave you stuck in a kind of emotional limbo and not be able to get on with your life. I have a list of resources at the end of my PowerPoint, and I have it in a PDF, so if you want a copy of the resources. But there are two best books I've read recently on ritual. Both are done outside, well, they're done in relationship to, but outside the post-Enlightenment Protestant culture of the U.S. So one is a book by a group of authors named Seligman. It's called Ritual and Its Consequences, on the Limits of Personal Sincerity. That's the subtitle. And they're the ones that they studied ritual from historical sources like in Confucianism all the way through to modern period and all these different places in the world, and said that what happened to the West is that we basically took on the Protestant sort of aversion to ritual and an emphasis on rationality from the Enlightenment, and ignored what all these other cultures say about the power of ritual. And so they're making a case that ritual is actually way more powerful than Protestants have given it any credence about. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. So can we reload that? Is it back? Okay. So how is it that rituals do this? So there's a historian of religions from the University of Chicago that, like in the early 90s, said this about ritual. In its effectiveness, his name is Jonathan Z. Smith, in its effectiveness, ritual is not best understood as congruent with something else, such as a magical imitation of desired ends, a translation of emotions, a symbolic acting out of ideas, a dramatization of a text, or the like. Rather, ritual is a collective process of handling conflict, confusion, and moral struggle. This transformative force of ritual is especially useful in handling the struggle with multiple role conflicts and moral contradictions. It engages inner ambivalences about experiences without putting the weight on individuals to manage the struggle solely via their own personal sincerity. Ritual gains force where incongruence is perceived and thought about. So that's, and Seligman, the Seligman book uses Jonathan Smith a lot. So how it works is it works by all your capacities. When you're in a ritual, your imagination is engaged, your ability to, your body is engaged, your perception is engaged, your emotions are engaged, and even your thinking. So it's a multifaceted way of engaging human beings for the possibility of change. And this is an image of you have a modern image of baptism, and you have two ancient images of baptism from the same city in the same time frame. One is, and there are two baptistries in that city, Ravenna, and these are early 6th century images of Jesus being baptized. And they both have, it's interesting, they both have the River Jordan personified as a deity, pouring the water into the River Jordan. And then they have John the Baptist in his woolly clothing. In the one case, he's putting his hand on Jesus' head, and the dove is spewing water on Jesus from the sky. In the other, John is sort of catching the water and pouring it over Jesus' head. But Jesus is clearly naked in both of them, which is how ancient people were baptized. They were baptized naked on Saturday night before Easter. That was a tradition. And the preparation, and the reason that Jesus looks 15 in one and looks 30 in the other is that the Jesus that's 15 is the Arian church that believed he was the Son of God, and the other one is the church, the Orthodox church, that believed that Jesus was equal to God. So you see ancient church images where Jesus looks like a teenager, it's because it's an Aryan church image. It's kind of interesting. It's just a slight theological difference. They both believed he was divine. It was just whether he was equal to God or not. So in the modern thing, I grew up with a father who was from Mississippi in the military, but every summer we would go for a month to Augusta, Mississippi to pick cotton and attend Baptist churches. And there was always revival stuff going on. And so people would like go forward and immediately get baptized. My aunt and uncle did that. They went forward and the next day they were in the river getting baptized. You could never do that in the ancient church. They actually took baptism very seriously. If you were going to be a Christian, you had to make application to the bishop of the church. You had to tell them what your occupation was, all those sorts of things. If they accepted you, you were put into the order of catechumens and stood in a particular place in church, so everybody that was a member knew who was trying to get ready for baptism. And some people, like the emperors and the Roman officials, couldn't get baptized until they were dying, because in order to be baptized, they would have had to quit their job. You couldn't be baptized as a Roman official. You couldn't be baptized as a brothel owner. You couldn't be baptized as a gladiator. So those people remained in the status of catechumen. When they made application and decided they wanted to be baptized, that meant they had to change their occupation. They were very strict about this sort of things. Because once you were baptized, then you were a member of a citizen of paradise, planted in this world as the church. And you had an obligation to take care of everybody in the congregation. Everybody had, you made a real commitment to being in that church. So in our book, Saving Paradise, Rebecca Parker and I described getting ordained in the church, becoming a member of the church was a little like applying to college with references and getting accepted to attend. And then while you were attending, you took a lot of theology classes, you trained for an Olympic team sport, and went through group therapy. And then you could make application to be baptized, and then you went through 6 weeks of Lent where you fasted 5 days or 6 days a week, and you did all this discipline stuff, and then you got baptized. So your first meal at the Eucharist was after you hadn't eaten for a week, and it was Sunday morning of Easter. And everybody came in, they were baptized Saturday night. The bishop baptized everybody all night long in cold water. When they came out of the baptismal font, they were given a white linen robe of glory and a candle, and they all processed to the cathedral to have their first Eucharist at sunrise on Easter. It was a very dramatic process. The entire community turned out for the baptisms. Augustine tells a story about a very famous philosopher that had been kind of critical of Christianity, and he showed up to be baptized. And when everybody goes in the water naked, he came out of the water and had his robe and processed with the church. They were all saying his name and cheering for him. It was like a graduation ceremony, right? Popping corks, whatever. That was how baptism was done. It's a very serious ritual process. They took it very seriously. I don't think anybody does that anymore, but it's an interesting understanding of what it meant to be a baptized Christian, the kind of commitment involved, and the kind of change. It's like joining the military. 9 weeks, you had to go through serious training into the habits of a citizen of paradise. So there are so many things in ritual that help. The singing, actually, group singing is really good for people. It lifts your mood. It's really good for you, as is movement. In ancient churches, nobody sat. There was a lot of processional movement in the ancient church. So lots of things. These are just images of things that we do in our veterans program. Not the taiko drumming so much, but things that help people lift their mood. It gets you through the tough stuff, the art and the beauty and all of that. And my friend Susan Diamond, who's been working on moral injury as long as I have, has created for her own church something called Soul Repair Circles, in which she trains elders as peer facilitators in the method that we use that's very ritualized, to have small groups of people meet together for a period of, I think, 8 weeks to talk about moral injury and share. And we use mindful breathing, we use deep listening, which is a very ritualized process of speaking where people share, but there's no expectation that they're questioned or commented upon. They just share what they're carrying, and people listen in compassionate silence and take it in. And everybody gets a chance to share, and then after everyone's shared and there's been silence, then a conversation. And the conversations after that kind of silence and listening are very different than the back and forth you might get in a regular group process. And so she's been working on that. We've been teaching that process at various church assemblies and things to people. So what are signs of recovery? It's actually a willingness to accept what one has experienced and suffered as a sign of your moral character. I tell people the pain you're in is a sign of the goodness in you wanting out. It's a return to relationships and community, not as somebody before, but somebody that's integrated what has happened. My friend Tyler says if somebody tells their moral injury story over and over the same way, they're hiding behind the story. They're not processing. So you could never regain your innocence or who you were before the moral injury experience, because life changes us if we're moral people. So it's returning to relationships because you're no longer afraid of those feelings. And an increasing ability to integrate those experiences. It's not like you think about it once, process it, and it's over. Every veteran I've worked with around this, every time I meet with them, they have a different angle on what their experience was. And I can tell they keep thinking about it, keep reframing it as their lives move on. It's a lifelong process, really. But as long as you're in process, you're doing all right. It's when you stop that it's not good. And a sign of recovery is that you're able to look forward and to reconnect to others and to experience positive emotions like joy and wonder and curiosity. Those tend to disappear when somebody's deep in a moral injury crisis. And so recovery is like a labyrinth. You keep moving, and different angles, you see things, you notice, right? And I just want to say, we have, if you have people that you know, or you yourself hit something that you really need to process and don't have anybody to talk to, we have these online groups. We started in 2020 when we saw the pandemic was going to be a major crisis for people in healthcare, and we have healthcare systems in VOA, and so we decided to try it with our own staff to offer this 1 hour online small group processing. And now AARP does it for their Fraud Watch program. We have a healthcare company using it with graduate nurses. And then we have a new one that we've done for the past year with a grant for first responders specifically. It's facilitated by first responders. And then we have one for the general public. They happen several times a week. All the facilitators are trained, but they're peers. In other words, they're not in there as professionals. They're not in there to fix anything. They're in there as people who have experienced moral distress and moral injury and know what it feels like and are willing to help people process it. That's what we call a peer. And then there's Susan and I did a podcast, a 6-part podcast that's actually for clergy and churches. That's various aspects of moral injury, and it's available. And then these are places you can go if you want to stay connected to what's going on with moral injury. We update our resources page every week now. There's something every day coming out. So it's vetted. The person who directs the Shea Moral Injury Center actually looks at the resources and picks the best ones and puts them in our resource list on our website. That's updated every week, and often she posts them also on the Facebook page. So you can stay on top of stuff that's coming out on moral injury. And so we have a bunch of that stuff. We also have the newsletter every month that just highlights the best things that have come out that month on moral injury. And when I started this work in 2012, there were like, 3 or 4 things a month. Now there are 3 or 4 things a day. That's how this whole concept has exploded beyond the veteran population. And so that's the list of resources, and we can end the show now. And I think there's still time for questions, isn't there? A little bit.
We do have time for a few questions both here, and then there were a couple that came in online. If you have a question, we want to begin here. I will ask that you come up and use this mic. That way we can see you in the webinar and you won't be a disembodied voice. So think about if you have a question, a moment we have time for, at least 2 or 3, I think, here. Let me say one thing, though, because there were some questions online about this. Everyone who registered for this program will get a copy of this talk. And there were questions about would this PowerPoint be available for those watching? And yes, the PowerPoint and everything in the presentation and the resources you gave at the end will all be available, not for everyone who signed up. So those who are asking, I wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, even the people that aren't here.
Absolutely. Anyone, and will go up on our website. Yeah. Once you get on our website, you almost never get off, and it'll be available for a long time. Questions? Are there some folks here who have, if you could come up here and ask your question. I know you have to make your way through, but we appreciate that. And just to keep your question as brief as you can, and look forward to talking with Dr. Brock here for a while. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. Great discussion. Matt Gobush, I'm with the Episcopal Veterans Network. It's a new organization we're standing up. I had 2 questions maybe. One, first, really enjoyed your comments about ritual and the role of ritual and the power of ritual potentially to heal moral injury. Any thoughts, I would appreciate your thoughts on forgiveness and rituals, Christian rituals of forgiveness. It's my understanding in the Eastern Orthodox faith, for instance, there are rituals of forgiveness for returning soldiers that we don't necessarily have in the Western tradition or haven't had for some time.
Yeah.
And the second question, if I could, you mentioned that the VA has in part kind of recognized moral injury as a form of PTSD. Has the VA welcomed religious organizations to provide support in the way that we see in the Defense Department? The military chaplaincy program is well established. Is there the same kind of dialogue between faith-based organizations and churches and the VA? And if not, is that something that could be addressed? Thank you.
Yeah, both of those are great questions. I'll do the second one first. The VA has pushed on training its chaplains to handle moral injury. And so Keith Mader and Jason Newsma direct what's called the Integrative Mental Health Program for the VA, in which veterans who are diagnosed with PTSD often also get chaplain care, and the chaplains and the mental health professionals actually cooperate around it. And then there's a program called Building Spiritual Strength that was used out of the Minneapolis VA and tested. And what's interesting is that they put one group of veterans with PTSD in a group therapy situation, and the other one they put in the same group process, but with a chaplain talking about things like forgiveness and God and evil and those kind of questions. And the group that had the time with the chaplain had better outcomes on their PTSD treatments. That was interesting. So there's some of that work going on at the VA, but it's still the case. I just had a post from a friend on Facebook who is at the Denver VA. She said nobody there's heard of moral injury. So she's been working on it a long time, so she's trying to introduce it there. So I think it varies some from VA to VA. Christopher Webb, the anthropologist I mentioned, who said that the medicalized model hid the moral suffering of veterans. And he said that was the problem with the PTSD diagnosis. It just erased the moral suffering that veterans were experiencing. He actually found a VA somewhere that had Lakota healers willing to accept non-Native veterans in the program. And he was being treated by the VA for PTSD. He said it was helpful for PTSD, but he was still feeling miserable. So he went to he went through a whole sweat ceremony with a Lakota healer, and that's what really helped him. So some VAs are providing that. I would suspect in places where there are a lot of Native American veterans. So there's some variation, I would say, in various VA mental health centers. We're working with the VA in the Brentwood property in Los Angeles because they have a historic chapel. So we've worked with the architects who are going to refurbish that chapel, and that's going to become a moral injury center on that campus. And we're going to run it for them because we have an evidence-based program that works. So I think it varies. So that's my question. But it is possible in the VA. And I know up in northern New York, I forget, I think it's Syracuse, one of the chaplains up there has even done the work with creating a moral injury experience wheel that identifies different aspects of moral injury that he said veterans often don't even have language for how they feel, so having something to do that really is helpful. And then your forgiveness question, yeah, the West kind of gave up on the penance system. And I think that's part of the function of the last 200 years of mental health professionals regarding guilt and shame as neurotic and as mental health, just part of mental health problems. So I think churches kind of stopped. People started saying, well, if you talk about sin, you're guilt tripping people and you're going to make them mentally ill, blah, blah, blah. So I think there's been hesitation in a lot of churches to even open that door. Catholics still do it. I mean, they still have confession and some of that, and absolution. But I think forgiveness works for some people and not others. It's not a concept in Buddhism. My friend Camilla, who grew up Catholic, his father was a major musician for liberation theology, so left-wing Catholicism. He grew up that kind of Catholic, and then he went to Iraq and he killed someone. And I asked him one time if he thought about forgiveness at all. And he may have changed his mind since that conversation, but he said it didn't work for him because he didn't know the person he killed. He didn't know where they were from. He didn't know anyone related to the person. So there was no one to apologize to. And so he didn't think he could forgive himself if he didn't have forgiveness from the people he'd wronged. And that's a very Jewish concept. God can't forgive you. The people you harmed have to forgive you. If you wronged God, God can forgive you, but not if you wronged other people. But for him, he said, I don't know that I really want forgiveness. He said, I don't think I'd be a moral person if I ever started feeling okay about killing someone. He said, so I'm okay with feeling terrible about it. He said, it inspires me to right other wrongs, to make my life, make a positive contribution with my life. So I think forgiveness is I think I actually agree that we need to pay more attention to those kind of rituals because it's really hard when you don't have a place to go and you need to process something that you are so ashamed of you wouldn't tell it to a therapist. That's a lot of our vets in our program. Oh, I would never have told my therapist this stuff, but I could tell other vets. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Is there another question? Yeah, Beth.
Beth Braxton, Parish Associate here at New York Avenue, and thank you for this understanding of moral injury and your mention of small repair circles. Throughout my 40 years of ministry in the Protestant Church, Presbyterian, I have always noted how important small groups are, and I was wondering about your history. I mean, I go back to the 70s, there was listening groups, there was serendipity groups, there was Christ care groups. All of these were programs for the church, and I was kind of interested, is this soul repair circles kind of a program, so to speak, or a ministry that a church can institute? That's one. And two, a lot of what you're saying sounds a lot like the importance of AA groups. The 12-step program, to me, has been one of the most, it becomes church for so many people. AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Sex Anonymous, whatever.
You know, just to say, you know that Alcoholics Anonymous was founded by the Oxford movement in England,
Yes.
and they based it on ancient Christian penance practices.
Yeah, yes.
So there it is, right? That's the one form of penance that still exists, and it's completely secularized except for the higher power, but it comes out of Christian penance practices.
Right, and there is
Yeah.
a book on the 12-step programs for churches, for
Yeah,
us,
yeah,
you know, even
yeah.
though I don't think I have an alcohol
Yeah.
problem, but I've got
Well,
issues.
I remember those small groups because I studied at Claremont Seminary with Howard Kleinbell, who was the great innovator and the person who figured out that you could do small groups in churches that weren't Sunday school. Yeah, weren't like that. And so there was a flourishing in the 70s and 80s of these small groups. I think part of what happened to churches is that you've got two-income families, and the economy has made it impossible to have people do all the kind of time and volunteering for churches they used to do because the middle class has been decimated since the Reagan Revolution. I'm sorry, but that's a little bit political, but we see the economic trends, right? We see the disappearance of the middle class, and churches depended on the middle class to sustain themselves as all the volunteers, the choir groups, all of that. So Susan's trying to bring that back in a little bit. It's yes. Well, the talking circles, there's scripts, and we offer online training for facilitators through our one-day course. It's called MIRAC, M-I-R-A. It's Moral Injury Recovery Aftercare. And so we're having a session of that at the end of September. We also have a 50-hour certificate program for people who really want to go a deep dive, especially professionals who want to integrate moral injury work into their chaplaincy work or their social work practices. So, but yeah, it's not a small group. Our soul repair circles are not small group discussion groups. They're really a ritual process to support people who carry really difficult stuff, to feel safe enough and accepted enough to share things they would never tell anyone. And in one of her groups, she had somebody reveal something from his childhood that was really difficult, and there was a professional therapist in the group who was not there as a therapist, but just as a member of the group. So she didn't say anything, but she was worried about this person. So the next day she went to Susan and said, I'm a little worried about that person. You might need a therapist to help him process. And Susan said, it could be, but then I think the next afternoon, the person who had shared came in and said, I am so grateful for the group. I've never been able to tell anybody that. I was so glad people were so kind to me. It really helped them. So sometimes that's all a person needs. But we always recommend that the peers who do the facilitation be backed up by a chaplain, a clergy person, or a mental health professional. Because you don't want ordinary people to have to handle a mental health crisis. Yeah, that's just a standard for peer specialist work. Yeah.
In your first lecture, you introduced me to the concept of moral injury, and for that I'm extremely grateful. I've been able to apply the terms and the vocabulary that you've described and presented in many personal respects, as well as in a broader way. And so I have thought that this was a universally applicable concept that would help not just me personally, but all of us to better understand the life that we're living.
Yeah.
I was recently, just this week as a matter of fact, introduced to a use of the term and the concept of moral injury in a way that interrupted my thinking that this was a universally applicable principle or concept that would help us all live well together. The Fifth Circuit this week affirmed in substantial part, the decision of the Texas judge who ruled that the abortion pill was unconstitutionally approved by the FDA in 2000. One of the judges in that case uses the concept and the term moral injury to justify the court considering that case. It is a standard principle of law that in order to present any case, you must suffer some harm, some injury. You must allege it and then prove it.
Yeah.
Here's what, I'm going to read one paragraph that the judge wrote as a justification for the plaintiffs in that case having standing, having the right to present the case. Here, plaintiffs have alleged conscience injuries analogous to those historically recognized at law and in equity. The FDA's approval of mifepristone creates a substantial risk that plaintiffs will be forced to participate in the abortion process. Quote, more physicians with ethical and medical objections to abortion will be forced to participate in completing unfinished elective chemical abortions, just as my partner was. Another quote, the FDA's expansion of chemical abortion harms my conscience rights because it could force me to surgically finish an incomplete elective chemical abortion. I object to abortion because it ends a human life. Now, I have no reason to doubt the sincerity of the doctors whose words were quoted.
Yeah.
Those words and that very concept in that situation are highly offensive to many other people of conscience.
Yeah.
And so, and yet their conscience is now reflected in the law of the land.
Yeah, this is a different use of the term. There is a long history in England from the 19th century forward of using the term moral injury in legal cases because a person was somehow harmed and their conscience was violated and they were forced to do something. That's different from the way it's being used currently in relation to the VA and the development of the term from the way they were using it at the VA. It's not a jurisprudence term. It's more a spiritual and mental health term. So what you're talking about is this history of the use of moral injury as something that you could bring a case about, that you were somehow affected by. I think the problem with the limitations of that are that other people would feel morally injured from not being able to help somebody have an abortion. For example, a 9-year-old child whose body couldn't carry a baby to term and would die if she were forced to be pregnant. So I think that argument goes both ways in relation to the abortion question.
The question that's presented is, what is the principle? I was understanding before that the principle was avoiding moral injury, but now
I don't think moral injury is avoidable.
What I'm now wondering is, what is the higher principle that determines which moral injury we need to be healing?
I think there's not a hierarchy. I think that anyone carrying moral injury would be better off processing it. I know that Jonathan Shea especially was very concerned when he coined the term in 1994. He was concerned about preventing it in the military by, because of the Vietnam War, the military leadership was so corrupt and so bad. And so he worked with General Mattis on moral leadership training. And I think there might be some forms of moral injury preventable in that sense. If we fixed a poverty system, there would be a lot of people who wouldn't get moral injury because they had adequate resources for a decent life. If we fixed racism, I mean, there are lots of systems where if we had justice and things like that, you could prevent some forms of moral injury, but I don't think it's entirely preventable. I think it's part of the human condition of being born moral into a chaotic reality and living with the illusion of control until we don't have it.
We're pleased to have these good questions, and we're going to extend our time here about 10 more minutes beyond what we were originally going to close, just so there's time for a couple of other quick questions. We have one in person, then I have one from online. I want to pause, and then we'll make a couple of announcements and close, but we won't stay long beyond. So one more question here.
Okay.
I have a story which I'm not sure how it relates to moral injury, so you could maybe tell me if it does. I was an Air Force pilot, spent 18 months going in and out of the Vietnam, carrying cargo from California to Vietnam. I got reassigned to do permanent combat duty, and by that time I had enough experience with talking to combat veterans and so forth. I decided that I was not going to do it. And my options were to refuse an order, be court-martialed and spend a year in jail, go to Canada and never come home again. And I thought, well, maybe if I can just get them to take away my flying status, at least you can't go to, Air Force people don't go to Vietnam unless they're flying. So I tried that, and I was told that, no, you can't do that. And then I said, well, you probably don't want me to be in Vietnam fighting for you because I'm actually supporting the other side. And so that did it. And so I didn't know, I guess I was, they said they were going to court-martial me, and I didn't know exactly what my options were, but a third option came in. It turns out the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors in Philadelphia had people who counseled the CO thing, and I said, you know, I'm not qualified for CO because I'm a warrior. I did the training and stuff. I was told by this counselor that the Air Force has an underground railroad for pilots, special thing. If you're willing to accept a fake diagnosis of insanity, you'll get an honorable discharge. All you have to do is pretend to be crazy for about 3 months, and then you're free. And so I just followed his example, and it worked like a charm. And so I ended up with an honorable discharge, and as a result, my wife and I were able to get a GI loan and buy a house. But the whole thing made me feel like, I don't know, alienated or disqualified from life in private society, because this whole thing was not part of the American dream. And, you know, since I'm a healthy 80-year-old man, I think I've obviously survived the experience. But I feel like, I don't know if I've had moral injury or not, but I feel alienated from American society because they did this to me, and because they had a war for which there was absolutely no justification.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's obviously something you've carried for a long time, and I appreciate your sharing that story. It's the movie Catch-22, isn't it? Yeah. I think it's moral injury if you feel like you haven't been able to live a full and effective life. And that's a personal decision around how it feels to you. But clearly it's bothered you enough that you needed to say it. And I'm glad you got a chance to say it. So thank you.
From online, I just have one, there were a couple of questions that you could answer briefly about the applicability of this idea to other situations. One woman, Anne, didn't identify from where, said, it seems this is likewise applicable to widespread clergy abuse,
Yes.
both the perpetrators and the victims. So if you just comment briefly on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two sides of this. It's like the recent, not even recent, it's an old story in the Catholic Church of sexual abuse. It's been repeatedly coming up. And then the Southern Baptist mess. After they had their sexual abuse report, and even high ups in the Baptist Church were named, then they decided this summer to eject any church that ordained women. I thought, oh my goodness. So there's that side of it, where people who are in those traditions feel betrayed by their own leaders, right? But then, I had a student, of course, at Bright Divinity School who was an intentional interim minister, and she realized, she thought, that the reason that there are these churches that are mean to their clergy is that they had some kind of crisis that created a moral injury crisis in the church, and they never resolved it. So they have a kind of low-level anger about that winds up being visited on every new minister, and they burn through ministers all the time. So she saw her work as an interim minister as maybe trying to help those mean churches, as she called them mean churches, come to terms with why they couldn't trust the ministers they hired. So yes, it isn't limited to Christians, and this is, there's been sexual abuse in Buddhist communities. It's just there. But I think it's aggravated in Western Christianity by this this sort of understanding of human beings as sinful, and these tight parameters put around desire, so that people's desires pop up in pathological ways because they don't have an open and clear way we just don't have very healthy forms of sexuality taught in. I have a friend who tried in the 70s to get the Methodist Church to let people who live together be in there. There are all these things he was trying to sort of open up around the sexuality coming out of the feminist movement in the 70s, and he didn't have any luck with it. Yeah.
Good. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Dr. Brock. What did you find particularly interesting or helpful about this program? And type it into chat. We'd love to hear that and see that. And you here maybe want to make some notes yourself, those who are here in person, about what you learn. Again, I find that if we write down insights, certainly it helps me to carry them with me as I go forward. So we'll keep the chat open for those online who want to type in some response about what you learned again from this program. Invite you all to also make notes. Those who are here in person are going to continue this conversation. We're going to have lunch and continue to talk. We'd love to have the 150 or more of you who are online in last count join us, but not possible in that way. But we're delighted you came and in person. We're delighted for those of you who tuned in, and we just thank you again for your participation and wish you a good day. Thank you very much.